Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Scott Bush and I'm here with Brian Flynn, Attivio's Director of Solution Architecture. Brian will take us under the hood of the Attivio platform to demonstrate features and configuration of Attivio connectors. But before we get started, I'd like to bring your attention to the question panel on your right. We'll have time at the end for Brian to take your questions, so please feel free to submit your questions. We love to take them, so please ask away, and I'm sure that others will benefit from that as well. All right, let's dive right in. Brian, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Scott. So Scott mentioned this is one of our series of tech talks. Again, as you would imagine, fairly technical kind of agenda for today's 30-minute session. So, I do want to get started with just giving a high-level overview of the platform and quickly diving into the areas of the architecture we'll be covering. Some of you who have attended our tech sessions in the past, this may be kind of repetitive for you, but for the benefit of all, it's important to just walk through all the different pieces that make up the Attivio platform, so we all have a good starting point here. So let's jump in. So our mission at Attivio, we are the leading cognitive search and insight platform company, and our mission statement is really to help our customers create relevant experiences for their employees, their customers, and their partners. So how do we do that? As a platform, the platform has been around for 10 years. It's gone through several iterations of, improvements over time. We are currently on version 5.5 of our platform, which is what I'll be demonstrating to you all today. And really the encompassing features and capabilities of the platform fit into these 8 critical requirements, which have been defined not only by Attivio, but certainly from our customers, as well as the market and the analysts that we work with on a regular basis, some of which you probably already have talked to in your travels when you're evaluating what cognitive search means to you and your company. Today specifically, we're going to be focused on 2 areas of critical requirements. The second and third one I have listed on the top row here. Our ability to connect to comprehensive data sources in a robust manner, and how we can extend how we process the data we connect to in a very extensible manner. So, just going through these real quick, what you're seeing here is not an exhaustive list. Please do not fear the fact that we only have a couple logos up here. These are just the ones that we most commonly see and run into. I'm sure folks on the phone will have very specific questions about their very specific connector requirements that they have. And if we don't cover off on those today through the course of our conversation over the next 30 minutes or taking your questions, certainly feel free to reach out to us afterwards. But the long and short of it is, Attivio has a very robust set of connectors that allow us to connect to enterprise sources such as SharePoint, Jira, Jive, Google Drive, Box, ServiceNow, Exchange. We also have database connectors that allow us to connect to anything that speaks JDBC or ODBC, whether that's your SQL server, MySQL, Hive running in Hadoop, or what have you. Those are all supported. And we also have file system crawlers and web crawlers. So I'm going to show you a mix and match of some of these today. And again, if we don't cover off on something you were hoping to see today, certainly feel free to reach out either during the call today or afterwards. And once we actually have access to these data sources, the obvious next question is, what do you want to do with it? Connecting to those data sources is maybe not even half the battle, but the next obvious question is, how do you want to process your PDF content that you're pulling down from your SharePoint environment versus the Word documents you're pulling through from your ServiceNow environment versus these database rows that exist within your SQL Server system. And I'm going to show you how you can start to manipulate and manage some of these workflows directly through our administration console today. So again, one of the last slides I wanted to show here before we jump right into the kind of administrative overview and technical conversation is a high-level picture of our architecture. And specifically, we're going to be focusing on these 3 areas down below here. So, we've talked about the requirements that we'll be walking through in terms of what are the types of avenues that data can make its way into the platform, how can you manage and manipulate that data to process it in a way that will meet your business requirements. And it really kind of bakes into these 3 main components. Read from the bottom up, our data sources and the data connectivity that we provide really come through one of 2 avenues. You can either use one of these out-of-the-box connectors, which I'll be walking you all through today, which can kind of cover off on some of the examples we've shown previously, SharePoint, Jira, ServiceNow, web crawling, etc. We also have content APIs and Java SDKs that allow our customers to build out, whether it's their own custom connectors or building out their own integrations with their applications that push information and data sources into the Attivio platform. So you kind of have the best of both worlds here, whether it's a connector that we have out of the box that supports your specific version of SharePoint, or if you want to build in a custom integration to your custom service or application, you can do that. And all of that data will flow through these ingestion workflows, which I'll walk you guys through in terms of how this can be managed and manipulated and how you can start to really enrich the end user experience using some of these out-of-the-box capabilities, as well as maybe building out some of your own components as needed. And finally, once that data is ascertained and connected to, once it's actually processed through these ingestion workflows that you configure, all of that information gets stored in our universal index for searching and downstream applications. So with that, we're going to jump right into the demo here. I'm going to switch over to an administration view that we have set up for this demonstration today. This is actually an instance of Attivio that I've installed in our lab environments that we host locally for many different demonstrations, research projects, and proof of concepts that we work with for our customers. Specifically, what we're going to focus on here today is on the top left-hand corner. Anything that's listed under system management essentially are the pieces of functionality we're going to be focusing on today for how do you set up connectors, how do you set up ingestion workflows, and then how do you manipulate the different components that make up those ingest workflows. As you'll see, there's a decent amount of functionality on the left-hand side that we're not going to have time to cover in 30 minutes today. But again, if there are additional questions you guys have for things that we aren't covering, certainly feel free to follow up after this session. So right off the bat, what you're going to see here, when I click on this connector screen, we already have a single connector that's been set up here. And if I click on this connector, it's going to bring you to the configuration screen for what we currently have set up as a custom or as a CSV connector that's been configured to ingest a CSV file. So this is interesting for a couple of different reasons. One, it's a pretty straightforward connector that we have where you can actually use a CSV file as the entry point for ingesting content into the platform. But two, the interesting thing starts to become how do we treat that CSV file once we've actually pulled out all of the header information that exists within that CSV, every single row that's being attributed inside that CSV for essentially solving our business case of creating an index of news content. So real quick, what I wanted to show you is the makeup of the CSV file. I'll zoom in here real quick. It's a pretty simple CSV file, as you see here. There's really two columns of information. The first column is essentially what is the source of information that we're actually going to be connecting to, and this has just been defined by the CSV as BBC all the way through. And then we have a bunch of RSS feeds that are included as part of this. So this is just a simple way of showing that, you know, this is a fairly custom, but albeit simple CSV that we've created that's essentially a CSV of multiple feeds, whether it's 7 feeds in this file, whether it's 100 feeds or 1,000 feeds. You know, once you set up the connector to process the data in the way you expect it to, which is adhering to this format, you can essentially process as many different RSS feeds as you desire. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off this connector, and you'll see real quick it's going to run through those 7 different rows that are being processed. And it's already done. And you'll actually see right off the bat here, it says that we've connected and processed 7 different documents. But if you actually take a look at the sample front end that we include as part of the platform here, you're going to see it's much more than just those 7 docs. There's actually 57 pieces of content that are actually being pulled through from that data source. And if I just do a simple search for showing me every single piece of content that exists within this data source, you'll see that, you know, of the 7 feeds that we were processing, there are about 57 new news articles that are being pulled in from BBC. And right off the bat here, we've got a fully functioning search platform that allows us to search against these 57 pieces of content. So taking a quick step back for a moment, you know, we've kind of flashed forward through to show the connector that's being set up here, and I'll show another connector momentarily and creating one from scratch. But we've kind of passed over the process of, okay, what are you actually doing to this content once you're processing it? After you've connected to this data source, after you've parsed out this CSV file, how are you actually handling the processing stages for that particular CSV? And to the point where you can start to enable, you know, the different pieces of content that are coming out, the different pieces of title information, metadata that exists here, and even some of the automated text analytics that are performing through our cognitive AI capabilities on the left-hand side. You'll see locations are showing up, companies, people, you know, how did we actually set up the ingestion workflow to support that? So that's the next step I want to talk you guys through here today is you set up the simple connector for parsing out a CSV. how do you actually configure the ingest workflow down below here called RSS news to process it in this particular manner. So that brings us to the next section that I want to walk you all through here today. Under the workflows section of the Attivio administration console, you'll see there are 3 different types of workflows that we provide to all of our implementations. There's ingest workflows, there's query workflows, and there's response workflows. Today we're going to focus specifically on the various ingest workflows that come out of the box with the Attivio platform, and then show you how you can actually configure these yourself to manipulate how you want to process content yourself. So if you recall, the actual ingest workflow that we were using previously was called RSS news. So if I come into this ingest set of configuration options, you'll see here the different, 20 different ingest workflows that we already have available as part of this implementation. And if I click on the ingest workflow called RSS news, you'll see that our ingest workflows are essentially comprised of multiple different processing stages that are already predefined or custom implemented into a given Attivio platform. So the whole idea here is that for every row that exists within that CSV file, we're going to run every single row through multiple stages in order to get us to the point where we have an index of 57 pieces of content fetched from those individual RSS feeds. The first stage here is actually fetching the RSS content from the location that's been provided to us. If I actually double click on that, you'll see that the field mapping that we have here is essentially telling us you're fetching from that CSV field the URI column, and you're going to be essentially including all of the data that comes from that URI field into the bytes section of the Attivio document. And bytes is essentially just a way that we can manipulate byte level information, whether that's information that's XML, whether that's information that's HTML. It's essentially a way to actually store this information so that downstream processing stages know what to do with it when it has to then parse that XML out and then process it in a way that can be influenced downstream. So the first step is, how do I fetch this RSS feed? You use that fetching processing stage, you stuff that information into the bytes field, and then the next stage is, okay, now that I have this bytes field, how do I parse that XML to the extent that I can actually process this RSS to understand the title information that exists within this RSS feed, any of the encoded content, the author metadata, all of that information is going to be essentially processed through the downstream processing stages that exist here. So the bottom line is what you have at the end of the day is a single ingest workflow, an RSS news ingest workflow that understands how to fetch from that CSV file individual RSS feeds, process and treat the XML as XML within the bytes field, and then actually extract all the different information from the XPaths that exist in this processing stage to say, whenever we see a title field within an XML file, we want to process that and store it in the Attivio platform as a title field. When we see the source information coming out from the XPath, we want to process that as the source field. Link comes through as URI, description comes through as text. Again, when you kind of zoom out at a high level, this is fairly straightforward information in terms of how you understand how RSS feeds get processed, but it's important to understand because we're going to actually start manipulating this momentarily here. So all of this kind of feeds into the final ingest subflow that processes down below here. So you've kind of manipulated your RSS feed to understand how you want to treat XML files, the fields within that XML feed. And then the last stage here is, how do you want to actually just process a normalized set of data that comes through? And we have an out-of-the-box ingest workflow that allows you to do just that. It allows you to perform any amount of pre-processing that's required, any amount of Attivio linguistics that you need to actually process through. And the Attivio linguistics is really what's responsible for understanding, when I'm processing an individual news feed and an individual article from that news content, how do I run that content through the linguistics capability that Attivio has out of the box? So we can quickly understand what are the locations that are being mentioned within each individual piece of content? What are the companies that are being mentioned? Who are the people that are being discussed? So that you can quickly have an end user application that says, show me all content that's actually mentioning, this particular, Benjamin Netanyahu as an example here. And you can click on that as a facet and then show your end users how to quickly drill down on their 57 results to a single result as an example. So again, all of these different ingest workflows can be strung together through other processing stages. They can be defined as out-of-the-box processing stages that Attivio has that comes with Attivio platform installation, or you can string together other ingest workflows along the way. So now I want to take a step back here and we've kind of talked through the whole end-to-end process of we have a connector that's already been pre-configured. We have an ingest workflow that we've already pre-configured as well. Now let's talk about actually creating a new ingest workflow within the Attivio platform. So for this example here, I'm going to actually just use a pretty straightforward web crawler that we have. If anyone that's familiar with Google Search Appliance and is looking to actually migrate off of Google Search Appliance, this should be a very familiar concept to you in terms of spidering a particular web page or spidering a particular sitemap XML file or multiple domains that exist that you want to process and crawl and index. It's the same concept here. This is the same type of idea that we have, where we have our web crawler that comes out of the box with our platform, so that if you wanted to, say, crawl the ESPN Football Club blogging website, you can do that pretty easily here. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to create a new connector. We're going to define it and give it a name, ESPN FC as an example here. You have multiple different ways of actually defining what is the avenue by which you want to process content. Do you want to use a simple seed URI, which essentially is give me the home page of this site you want to spider and crawl, and then tell me how deep or how many levels deep of linking you want to actually spider that content through. So from the home page down to the first level of information and links that are being made available from that home page, through to the second level, through to the third level, whether it's 3 levels deep, 30 levels deep, whatever your requirements end up being, those are all configurable options for this particular web crawler connector that we have here. And again, we have other avenues for managing web crawling as well. If you want to do a sitemap URL, you could certainly do that. If you wanted to configure it so that you are indexing at a faster rate or a slower rate, that's pretty much handled by the batch sizes that we have as part of our ingestion connecting stages here. And then the last stage that we talked about previously is, okay, you're connecting to these data sources, you're actually spidering your content. How do you actually want to treat it once it's being processed here? And that's where you actually flow all of this information through our file ingest workflow as an example. So there's a lot of other configuration options that are available for the web crawler. We're certainly not going to get through all of them here today. I am going to set one configuration option. I'm going to increase the content size limit and essentially increase it by a couple orders of magnitude to ensure that we're able to ingest content of several megabytes as opposed to several kilobytes. That's more just a precautionary thing. And once we've saved out this connector, we can go ahead and kick it off. We check the box off here. You click on Start. Yes, I want to start this one connector. You could do that for multiple. If you had 10, 50, 100 different connectors, you could select them all as you needed. And then once you start this process, as you would expect, a web crawler is going to be a little bit more deliberate in terms of how it's processing content. And that's just to ensure that you're not necessarily flooding a particular website with what looks to be like a denial of service attack. That's why we have a lot of those precautions in place for configuration. But if it's a site that you manage and you own, you can certainly make it run much faster if you need it to. And while this is running here, I just wanted to show the file ingest workflow that we're actually sending it through. It's actually doing a little bit more here than the RSS feed that we saw previously. The web connector that we have, it's doing a lot of things around understanding what are the different, what is the actual web request that we're making, what are the links that are available. But the text extraction processing stages, those are actually what are going to investigate the HTML that's being fetched from that particular web page for that given web page that was connected to, and it's going to parse it out, clean it up, make sure that the only information that's available for downstream indexing is essentially stripped of all HTML. If you have requirements around parsing and processing HTML in different ways, you want to keep metadata tags, you want to actually manipulate or specifically read an H2 tag within your web page, you have the ability to create your own custom components that can do that. But for all intents and purposes, we're going to leave it through the standard file ingest workflow and let it kind of do its thing. It looks like we already have 90 pieces of content that are processed through, or at least that were interrogated. I'm going to go ahead and commit those so that we can see them right now. So I'm just going into our index screen and committing it, just forcibly saying, okay, this content that we've processed and is ready to be indexed, let's not wait for the commit schedule to run through. Let's just see that out of the box. And again, you see the 148 results that are coming through here. Again, a search index that allows you to understand who are the different people that are being mentioned within this pieces of content, what are the different entities that are being discussed, the different companies or team names that are being described in here. So I can say, show me all content that is talking about Jose Marino as an example. And I can get right to that result here. So the last thing I wanted to do before we run out of time here, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to stop this connector from running so I don't crawl the entire internet that is the ESPN soccer club. I'm going to hop back up to my home page and do a kind of get back to level set here. Let's see all the content that we have in the index so far. So 148 pieces of content. They've all run through that, the Attivio linguistics capabilities here. But let's say you have an example, a requirement where you know that Attivio can understand what are the different locations that are being discussed within these articles. So you know that Attivio is actually extracting the text of that information, and maybe you have a requirement where you want to actually create a map of those locations within this end user experience. So in order to do that, I've actually created a custom component that allows you to specifically understand what are the locations that are being described within every single document Attivio is processing, and then how do we then geocode that information into latitude and longitude coordinates. So the easiest way to do that is to find this ingest workflow, which is essentially the last stop for all of our documents that are processing within this platform. And then I can go ahead and look for this geocode component that I've already created. Geocode location as an example. And I'm going to drop it into this workflow, and then I'm going to put it right before our indexing stage, so that what's going to happen is if you double click on this processing stage, you're going to see that I've allowed this component to enable configuration to say anytime we see locations being automatically extracted by the Attivio platform, geocode it to latitude and longitude, and then essentially let the end user experience build a map of those coordinates. So I'm going to save my ingest workflow. I'm going to come back to this pretty standard RSS feed, the CSV RSS feed that we have from the beginning of our demonstration. Let's rerun that guy. And this one will take a little bit longer here because the geocoding does take some time. Before it probably took all of 2 seconds, but right now it's probably going to take up to 10 seconds is probably my guess at this point. So once it's done completing, let it do its thing. And now it's done. We're going to come back over to our screen here, refresh the page, and you'll see we now have a map of all the different locations that are being described within the news content that we've been processing previously. So again, any of the locations that are being automatically discovered by the Attivio platform are now running through a custom geocoding component that I've created. They're creating lat-long coordinates that allows us to enable this type of end user experience to say, I only want to see content that's mentioning or that's describing locations in Europe as an example. I don't want to necessarily click on Barcelona. I want to actually draw a pointed area on a map. I can draw that location map, click on update results, and we're going to drill down from the 157 results down to the 6 results that are mentioning these particular locations. So hopefully this kind of gives you the whole experience. Again, I think some of these are fairly high level, but it does give some good things to chew on for those that are interested in understanding what Attivio means when we say building up content connectors, integrating with text analytics that comes out of the box with the platform, and then integrating those services with maybe other third-party services, maybe other app capabilities that Attivio has out of the box, or maybe your own custom components that build out these types of compelling end user experiences. So again, we're never going to cover off on everyone's questions on the 30-minute call. We will take some questions now, I think, just to kind of wrap up the conversation. And if we don't get to your question in particular, we can certainly feel free to reach out to us, and we'll happy to have a follow-up conversation with you.
That's right. Thank you, Brian. As a reminder, on your right-hand side, there's a panel there where you can put your questions in, and we'll take as many as we can up until the bottom of the hour here. Looks like we have one.
Sure.
Do you guys have any OCR for scanned PDFs, or would that be a custom connector? We have scanned PDFs in SharePoint and need to index those.
Yep, that's a great question. So that's actually covers off very nicely on the 2 pieces that we've walked through today. It's really, the connector piece, how do you connect to these different enterprise sources, whether it is SharePoint, whether it is Google Drive, a database, what have you. And then once you've connected to those databases, those systems of interest, what do you want to do with them? How do you want to actually process that content? So in this scenario, we're talking about SharePoint, whether that's SharePoint Online, whether that's SharePoint On-Prem, 2010, 2013. And then once we've accessed those PDFs, how do you process it? How do you actually treat those PDFs maybe differently than Word content? So the whole scenario here around extracting PDF content from SharePoint and then extracting a different or creating additional meaning from what ultimately ends up being images, scanned images of maybe contracts, scanned images of maybe schematics information. We do have OCR capability that we've actually integrated and OEM'd into our platform that enables our customers to not only connect to SharePoint and then process PDF or connect to SharePoint and pull out PDF content, but then run it through an OCR stage all within the Attivio platform so that at the end of the day, you can have a very similar end user experience like the one I showed you previously.
Thanks, Brian. Another question, what social media connectors are available out of the box with Attivio?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We get that question all the time. I guess I would caution against anyone, if you're talking to any enterprise search platforms that are claiming out-of-the-box connectors for social media, that's likely not the case that they have one. We do not have one, and the simple reason is because it's not a technical limitation of connecting to a Facebook, a Twitter, a LinkedIn. You're really relegated to actually just playing within their walled garden, so to speak. So those are all public repositories of information, and generally speaking, taking Twitter as an example, Twitter does have an API that allows us to connect to that particular data source. And we actually have done those types of integrations in the past. But the reason we don't have an out-of-the-box connector is we are not able to connect to Twitter without access to an API key. And an API key for the Twitter Firehose, as an example, can be fairly cost prohibitive depending on your requirements. So if there are social media requirements where you want to do integrations into those platforms, again, there's no technical limitations that stop us from actually connecting to those data sources, but they're really more around business requirements and even some legal requirements to understand in terms of, are you able to connect to those sources in a way that would protect you from any type of liability?
Great, thanks, Brian. Another question here, how do you handle uniquely formatted access control lists from different enterprise sources like SharePoint, Jira, ServiceNow?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, we haven't even really talked that much about security. I'm sure we've done other tech talks in the past, and if there's more questions around how do we ensure that when you're connecting to a SharePoint versus a Documentum versus a Jira versus a file system, there's probably likely very sensitive information in those enterprise sources that you want to ensure those end users that are searching through those data sources, they're only seeing the things they should have access to see in the first place. You don't want Brian Flynn to be able to have access to all the salary information that HR is managing, as an example. So the way that we actually do that, the Attivio platform has the ability to ingest not only the documents from those repositories, but also what's commonly known as the access control list, which essentially says, for this given document, here are the lists of groups and users that have access to see it in the first place. And typically speaking, those access control lists are going to be handled pretty drastically differently between SharePoint, Jira, ServiceNow, any different connectors you're talking about. So what Attivio actually does is we still ingest and index those access control lists. We can associate them with the original document, but we normalize all of that access control list information so that the end user experience, you're still just logging in through maybe your Azure AD or through your OneLogin or directly through Active Directory to ensure that when Brian Flynn logs into their enterprise application, all of the access control lists are normalized within the platform to ensure that they only have access to see those results they should see in the first place.
Great. Another one here. When you feed data to the index from different sources, how will you differentiate data from different sources to the end user?
That's a great question. So that actually kind of speaks to the different ways you can treat and process content into the Attivio platform. The simplest way that our customers typically provide these types of end user experiences is when they're setting up these connectors, you can actually define in the connector definition and say, I want to associate this static piece of metadata for any piece of content that's processed through this SharePoint source or this web crawler or this file system. So SharePoint gets tagged with a source of SharePoint, file system gets tagged with a source of file, and then the web crawler gets tagged with a source of website or intranet site. So by doing that, you essentially are creating new metadata for every single piece of content that's indexed, and then that enables the end user experience to essentially just enable an additional facet request to say, for all of the results that are coming back, let's show an additional facet of source so that if Brian Flynn is looking for this particular PDF of interest, he can then drill down on showing me only content that comes from SharePoint, as an example.
Great. We're at the bottom of the hour here, but I do want to point out that Attivio offers a free trial. And Brian, if you could just take a quick second to explain what's in the box with that as it relates to connectors.
Sure. Yeah, so the trial does come out of the box with a couple of pretty high visibility and low effort connectors. Website crawling, database connectors, and file system connectors are essentially the three connectors that come out of the box with the trial. And again, you can go on our website and download it today and try it out. If there are other connectors that you're interested in playing with or testing out, things around SharePoint, things around Confluence, typically those are best served in kind of having a conversation and better understanding your requirements, and that's really what my team is here to help you with. Our solutions architecture team, we really have those types of conversations on a regular basis. So whether you want to try out the trial yourself, whether you want to reach out off the record, off the call here, either avenue is fine with us, and we'd be happy to help.
Yeah, good segue. There's a way that you can contact us if you'd like to have a private call with an SA. We'd be happy to set that up with you. I want to respect your time. There's a couple of questions we weren't able to get to. We'll make sure that we follow up with you shortly. But I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Brian, for being with us, and everybody for your time today. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks now.
Thank you.